The Legend of Zelda. It's one of the most popular and beloved gaming series of all time. And there's good reason for that. You have the original Zelda, which is considered to be one of the most revolutionary games. And then you have games like Ocarina of Time, which is considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. But for me, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker is not only the best Zelda game, but one of the best games ever created. And in this video, I'm going to be explaining that and a lot more, but before I do, I want you to take a look at that. And that. And that. You see, Zelda Wind Waker has influenced so many people, so many things. I mean, you could see it in my name. Glink is just Greg and Link combined. That's more of a Zelda thing, but you get the point, which is something else I'm going to be exploring. The amazing amount of influence Zelda Wind Waker had on not just me, but an entire generation of gamers. So join me on a nostalgic journey through one of the greatest games ever created, and the legacy it left behind. Like any great tale of gaming, it all started in the late 90s for me. You see, I grew up with two older brothers, and my introduction to gaming was from them. To me, the Nintendo 64, Game Boy Color, and PlayStation 1 were the three consoles that really got me into gaming, and especially a lot of Nintendo games. And for better or worse, most of my experience in these games was actually watching my oldest brother play. I distinctly remember watching him play games like Mario 64, Pokemon Stadium, and of course, Zelda Ocarina of Time. And we got this game a little bit late, probably near the year 2000. Whereas it came out in 1998, but still, I'd never seen anything quite like it. And to me, this was the introduction to Zelda games. I remember watching my brother play through some of the early dungeons and watching some of the early cutscenes, and I was completely in awe when I first saw them. It opened up a whole new world of adventure and mythology and fiction to me. And like I said, for the most part I was watching, yeah, I played a little bit here and there, but I didn't really get to fully experience Ocarina of Time until I was a bit older. And more than anything, Zelda introduced me to this feeling of adventure, and what it felt like to truly experience an awesome single-player game, which is something I feel like we've lost a little bit of over the years. Nowadays, the most popular games are all super competitive and multiplayer, and there's big money and tournaments and esports involved. All that stuff is great, and I myself love competitive gaming, but I feel like younger generations never really got to experience single-player games in their purest form, without jumping into a lobby and yelling at people over voice or getting kills on a scoreboard. Back then, it was just you, the game, the story, and total immersion into this universe. And for many people, Ocarina of Time is one of the greatest games to do that. And look, I can totally argue for that point of view as well. I love Ocarina of Time. But to me, Wind Waker was the ultimate game changer. So fast forward a few years to late 2002. The GameCube was a pretty new console, and we've been having a ton of fun with games like Super Smash Bros. And Mario Sunshine. And we'd heard of this new Zelda game coming out, but it seemed kind of weird. There was this new art style that was called cell shading. I know Wind Waker wasn't the first game to adopt this, but it was certainly the first time I had ever seen it. But I remember it stirring up a bit of controversy back then, and I'm sure you could still find some people who feel indifferent towards it now. There was a huge difference in how Zelda Wind Waker looked and the style of that game compared to a game like Ocarina of Time or any Zelda game before, and even most of them afterwards. Compared to the realistic, serious, gritty tone of Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker seemed sort of childish and cartoony. At first, a lot of people were sort of off-put by this. And me, being still a pretty young kid at the time, I didn't really care that much. I just wanted to play the game. So Wind Waker finally came out, and from the first time playing it and seeing the game fully realized, the style and art of this game is something that's truly striking and timeless. And again, I think this is why so many people seem to be influenced by it. The entire art style and visual concept of Wind Waker was hugely instrumental in adding to the theme and feel of adventure that this game brought. And that's something this game had a lot of: adventure. First of all, you started off on an island, and most of the overworld was covered with water, whereas every other Zelda game before, and in fact almost every other adventure game that I knew of before, was just land. And so a huge part of the game was sailing on the King of Red Lions. And ultimately, to me, this became the greatest adventure experience I'd ever had in a game. Now again, to many people, this is kind of a controversial thing. A lot of people hated the sailing, hated going across the sea and back again and all that kind of thing. But to me, I loved it. I loved going through the sea, exploring things, going to the next dungeon, going to the next island, fighting enemies in the middle of the ocean, going to these exotic places where there's secret hidden treasures, and to me, it was always more about the journey than the destination. Now, I realize by today's standards, the overworld of Zelda Wind Waker is probably pretty small compared to a lot of the huge games, but it didn't need to be huge. It didn't need to be infinitely big. No, it gave me the feel of being infinitely big. There didn't need to be 500 gigabytes of memory on the game or thousands of secrets to unlock, even though there were many. The true sense of adventure and exploration came from that feeling of sailing over the Great Sea, stumbling across these islands and sometimes spending hours there looking through every nook and cranny or playing mini games along the way. And I'll be honest, I'm glad I was pretty ignorant of the internet back then, because I feel like that would have ruined my experience a little bit, or at least made it not quite as immersive. Because if you see a giant map of everything to do and all the secrets are revealed, it does take a little bit away from that sense of exploration. Now, of course, a great Zelda game needs to have great dungeons, and to me, Wind Waker delivered on this perfectly as well. You had all these exotic locations of dungeons on islands, on volcanoes, in forests, and it didn't feel so linear, like you go from point A to point B all the time. There was always side quests and things to do in between. For example, I loved things like the traveling shop, where you just go in on this guy's boat and buy certain items, sometimes things you needed, sometimes there'd be rare items. You didn't always feel like you needed to go back to a central hub or a certain location that had everything you needed. Yes, Windfall Island and other key locations were necessary to progress the story, but again, you didn't need to progress the story. You could have fun just exploring and doing side quests. And of course, the characters were memorable. The pirates, for example, were really funny and animated. Tetra was the opposite of the damsel in distress. She was actually a pretty badass pirate herself. And even, for example, the townspeople of Windfall were pretty memorable. I remember the little gang of kids running around called the Killer Bees. They were interesting. And then you had the Eskimo who sold you items. And even the guy you sparred with on Outset Island was pretty cool. Of course, you had the incredibly goofy character Tingle, who was also interesting but pretty far out there. And of course, the bosses really fit with the theme of the game and the art style. They were always vibrantly colorful, and each and every fight felt intense and action-packed. And while I love Ocarina of Time to death, Wind Waker just had a more defined style. Zelda in Ocarina of Time was just the same old Zelda that we knew before. Ganon was the same old Ganon. Same goes for Link. And now, of course, these characters were fully realized and fully fleshed out and brought to life in Ocarina of Time, but in Wind Waker, all of these characters got completely reworked and redesigned in a way that completely stood out. I mean, for God's sakes, you're riding on the King of Hyrule's back the whole game, who is in boat form. And yeah, Tetra just turned out to be Zelda, but you saw a pretty badass side of her, which to Ocarina of Time's credit, it did have in the form of Sheik, I guess. But still, Zelda being a pirate, that's pretty cool. And again, the art style, the characters, all of that meshed so well with this huge open world feeling of the game. It made it feel like this huge grand adventure and this journey to the ends of the earth, from one dungeon to the next, until the epic climax. And of course, even after that, there was plenty to do in the game still. And of course, the lively sounds and music really lended itself well to this atmosphere of exploration. Some of my favorite tracks from video games are actually found in Wind Waker. What was so beautiful about the music was that they used percussion instruments in tandem with a lot of wind instruments and things like the flute, which made the game that much more memorable and perfect to me. You can instantly recognize a track from Wind Waker just based on how it sounds. All of these factors working together is what solidified Wind Waker in gaming history, which has had profound influences that you can find even today. Not to mention the spin-off games that came out of it, the Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. The whole idea of Toon Link basically became his own character, separate from the traditional Link in a lot of ways. And of course, the countless people just like me who felt inspired and influenced by this game, by its art, and the sense of adventure it gave us. There's a lot of influences of Wind Waker within games like Skyward Sword and now with Breath of the Wild as well, which is great to see. For all of these reasons, Wind Waker to me is one of the greatest games ever made, and that sense of exploring and adventure will always have a special place in my life and in my memory. So hopefully I've broadened your perspective just a little bit on Wind Waker and why it means so much to so many people. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys.
Excuse me, Ocarina of Time has an aggregate score of 99.98 out of hundreds of reviews from renowned gaming websites. It is clearly the best game, you GameCube-loving fuck.
You know what? Fuck you! Why don't you lock yourself in the water temple for 40 hours, looking for 30 keys, and go fuck yourself, huh?